The rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a ghostly whisper through the night, and in the heart of the storm the old mansion flickered to life. But inside there was only a corpse. Someone had been here, someone who was never seen, and someone who left behind a single chilling question: does the truth live, or can it be killed too? A quiet morning had settled over St. Mary, but behind every quiet moment lay an untold story. Miss Eleanor Finch, whom the villagers affectionately called Aunt Finch, sat by her window, her fingers idly holding an old crochet needle, though her mind was more occupied with the world outside than the thread in her hands. The wind whispered through the hedges, carrying with it the distant chime of a church bell, a sound that seemed almost like time itself knocking at the door. The village bustled with its usual routines, but there was something different in the air today, an unspoken weight, a tension lingering just beneath the surface, as if a long-buried truth was about to rise. Then came the knock, 3 short raps, a pause, then the clearing of a throat. Eleanor sighed, as if she had been expecting this very moment. She opened the door to find Margaret Holloway, a woman whose weary eyes carried the kind of fear that only time could understand. "Miss Finch," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly, "I came straight from Holloway Manor. Something has happened." Eleanor remained calm, merely tilting her head in acknowledgement. "Come in, Margaret," she said, in her usual composed manner. Margaret hesitated at the threshold, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside, as if she feared something or someone was following her. "I was in the garden," Margaret began, wringing her hands, "just as I always am, and then I saw it, an old letter, half buried in the soil." Eleanor's lips barely moved, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, an understanding perhaps, or intrigue. "What did it say?" Margaret swallowed hard. "It spoke of an inheritance, a hidden truth, buried in my family's past. Miss Finch, if this letter is real, it could ruin everything." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if the very walls were listening. Eleanor studied Margaret carefully, her silence more telling than words. "And where is this letter now?" Margaret exhaled shakily. "I locked it away in my writing desk, but now I fear I made a mistake. What if it's already too late?" Eleanor allowed herself the faintest of smiles, the kind that spoke of old secrets and long-forgotten whispers. "People aren't afraid of secrets, Margaret," she said softly. "They're afraid of what those secrets bring out in others. And whatever truth is about to surface, its real danger lies in who stands to lose the most." Margaret's fingers tightened, a shadow of doubt flickering across her face. Do you think this will reopen old wounds?" Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Wounds only fester when they're left to hide in the dark. Come, let's go to Holloway Manor. It's time we let the truth speak for itself." The church bell rang again, its chime just as steady as before. And yet something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with a quiet sense of unease, as if history itself was knocking at their door. The morning in Ashford Hollow carried an eerie weight, the kind that settled into the bones before the mind could place why. Miss Eleanor Finch, a woman with the quiet patience of a clock, and the sharp eyes of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the patterns of human deception, sat by her parlor window, her knitting untouched in her lap. Outside, the wind stirred the copper-red leaves, sending them tumbling in restless spirals across the cobbled path. She had seen this before, the way the air changed just before the past forced itself into the present. A secret had surfaced, and secrets, she knew, never rose without consequence. The knock came, 3 sharp raps, precise and urgent. Miss Finch sighed, folding her hands over her shawl before moving to the door. Margaret Holloway stood there, her face pale, her gloved fingers trembling at the edges. "Miss Finch," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "I've come from Holloway Manor. There's been a death." The words hung, suspended like a thread on the edge of unraveling. Miss Finch stepped aside, motioning Margaret in, her mind already threading possibilities. Death at Holloway Manor was not new. It was an estate built on old wealth and older sins, but something in Margaret's voice told her this was different. "Who?" she asked, leading her to the firelit drawing room. Margaret hesitated, as if saying the name would set events into motion that could never be undone. "Sir Arthur Holloway," she finally breathed. "We found him this morning in his study, sitting there as if he'd simply gone to sleep." "But, Miss Finch, something was wrong. There was a letter, half burned in the hearth. It spoke of an inheritance, an illegitimate claim. I don't know what to do." Miss Finch's expression did not change, but her fingers curled slightly against the arm of her chair. "And where is this letter now?" Margaret swallowed. "The remains of it are still in the hearth, but I took what I could." The ink was smudged, but 2 words were clear, contested and forged. A pause. The wind pressed against the windows, whispering through the gaps in the wood. Then Miss Finch said finally, her voice steady, "It would seem Sir Arthur was not merely an old man with secrets. He was a man who had just learned the cost of one." By noon Miss Finch stood at the gates of Holloway Manor, the great house looming ahead like a watchful sentinel. The path was undisturbed, save for the brittle leaves collecting along the edges. The air felt still, too still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Inside, the housekeeper, a woman with the wary eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime noticing what others ignored, led her through darkened corridors, where dust clung to heavy drapes, and the scent of old paper and polished wood lingered like something waiting to be remembered. The study was just as Margaret had described. Sir Arthur sat slumped in his chair, his brandy glass tilted against his limp fingers, untouched. His expression was peaceful, but peace did not belong in a room where a fire had burned a letter to its final whisper. Miss Finch stepped closer, her sharp gaze falling to the scorched remains in the hearth. Between the blackened edges, she caught the faint ghost of ink, words that were never meant to be seen. "Poison," she murmured, not needing to check the glass. It was the simplest method when deception was the true weapon. The heavy footfalls of Inspector Ralston broke the silence. He was a man built for facts, not speculation, with the eyes of someone who had long stopped looking for the poetry in crime. He surveyed the room, nodding grimly. Poison, yes, no struggle, no forced entry, just a man who thought he had time left. He turned to Miss Finch, as if knowing she had already mapped the crime long before he arrived. "It's always the ones who think they know everything, isn't it?" Miss Finch only smiled, a small knowing thing. "No, Inspector," she said softly, her fingers grazing the scorched paper. "It's the ones who think their past won't catch up to them." The church bell rang out in the distance, its chimes steady, unchanged, and yet the air in Ashford Hollow had already shifted. The past had stirred, and Miss Finch, as always, had been the first to notice. The morning mist in Blackwood Hollow had not yet lifted when Miss Eleanor Finch stepped out onto the cobbled lane, her sharp eyes glinting beneath the brim of her hat. The village was always a quiet place, but today the silence carried the weight of unspoken things. Word of Lord Percival Dunridge's death had spread before the body had even grown cold. A heart attack, they whispered. Peaceful, they claimed, but Miss Finch had learned long ago that nothing about Blackwood Hollow was ever so simple. By the time she reached Dunwich Manor, the house had already settled into a state of carefully curated grief. The staff spoke in hushed tones, the drapes had been drawn, and the air carried the scent of extinguished candles and something deeper, something like fear. The constable, a young man with too much nervous energy and too little experience, stood stiffly at the entrance. "Miss Finch," he said, his voice a touch too eager, "Inspector Lowell has just arrived." She gave a polite nod, stepping past him. The drawing room was untouched, save for the absence of its former occupant. A brandy glass sat on the table, half empty, A book lay open as if abandoned mid-sentence. The death had been framed as natural, but Miss Finch's gaze landed on the hearth, where the faintest trace of burnt paper lingered in the ashes. Inspector Lowell, a man built of rigid lines and sharper intellect, followed her gaze. "You see something?" he asked. "I see something. Someone wanted to disappear," she replied, bending down just enough to catch the last remaining words on the charred fragment, "contested and unlawful." She exhaled slowly. "A will, I'd wager, one that someone was rather eager to keep hidden." The inspector's lips pressed into a thin line. "No sign of struggle, and forced entry. If it was murder, it was planned carefully." Miss Finch straightened, and yet, it wasn't careful enough. Outside, the village had already begun its ritual of speculation. Mrs. Calloway, the grocer's wife, was speaking in hushed but eager tones to Miss Henshaw, the postmistress. "I heard he'd been planning to change his will," she said, the words spilling into the autumn air like seeds waiting to take root. "Cutting someone out entirely. His nephew, perhaps. Or that distant cousin from London." Miss Henshaw, always one for dramatic flair, clutched at her shawl. "A man like that, keeping secrets his whole life. He was bound to have enemies." Miss Finch lingered in the doorway, letting the whispers unravel themselves before turning back inside. Dunwich Manor was a house of old wealth and older grudges, and if there was one thing she knew, it was that secrets never stayed buried for long. She moved through the corridors, past tapestries that had watched centuries pass and portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to hold silent judgments. In the study, a leather-bound journal sat on Lord Dunwich's desk, untouched by the hands that should have turned its pages. A name had been scrawled hastily across the last entry before the ink trailed off: Eleanor. A small frown tugged at Miss Finch's lips. She did not believe in coincidence. Inspector Lowell stepped into the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You think the village will tear itself apart with theories before we find the truth?" She gave a small knowing smile. "The village will do what it always does, talk until the lies drown out the truth. But the truth, Inspector, is much quieter. You just have to know where to listen." She traced a gloved finger over the spine of the journal before glancing back at the inspector. "And I have a feeling this particular truth will not stay quiet for long." The air inside Blackwood Hall was thick with unspoken truths, the kind that lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to claw their way out. The fire in the grand hearth had long since burned low, leaving only the faint glow of embers to cast restless shadows across the faces of those gathered. Miss Eleanor Finch stood near the mantelpiece, her keen eyes moving from one suspect to the next, dissecting their silences as much as their words. Lord Percival Dunwich was dead, found slumped over his desk with a glass of untouched brandy beside him, and no one in this room was innocent, not truly. Some bore their guilt like a weight, while others had buried it beneath carefully composed expressions. But Eleanor had seen enough deception in her time to recognize the cracks forming beneath the surface. Inspector Lowell, his presence as commanding as the ticking of the great hall's clock, swept his gaze across the room before speaking. "Let's not waste time," he said, his voice clipped. "You all had a reason to be here last night. I need to know why." There was a rustle of movement, a collective shifting of posture, as though preparing for battle. Lady Rosalind Dunwich, the grieving widow, was the first to speak, draped in black lace, her trembling fingers pressed delicately to her lips. But Eleanor saw through the act, the way her gaze flickered toward the solicitor, the way her grip tightened ever so slightly around the locket at her throat. "Percival was fine when I left him," she murmured, her voice a breath above a whisper. "He was writing something legal, I believe. I didn't disturb him." "Writing?" Eleanor's sharp mind latched onto the word. There had been no papers on his desk when the body was found, and yet the faintest indentation on the blotter suggested something had been removed. A missing will, a confession? If it was important enough to vanish, then it was important enough to kill for. The solicitor, Mr. Alistair Graves, cleared his throat, his fingers steepled before him in the careful manner of a man accustomed to half-truths. His spectacles gleamed as he met the inspector's stare with forced calm. Lord Dunwich had requested my presence the following morning, he admitted, though his tone remained distant. A revision to his will, nothing extraordinary, but Eleanor caught the flicker of tension in his jaw, the almost imperceptible hesitation, and yet, she mused, whatever he wrote last night seems to have disappeared. Curious, isn't it? A shift in the room, the weight of glances exchanged beneath lowered lashes, secrets pressing against lips, held in place by fear. Then there was Josephine Carroway, the housekeeper, her face carved from stone, her apron dusted with the faintest smear of ash, a detail Eleanor did not miss. His lordship dismissed me earlier than usual, Josephine said. Said he didn't want tea. Strange that he never turned it down before. Another inconsistency. A man set in his ways rarely abandoned habit without reason. Had he been too preoccupied? Or had he already suspected danger lurking close? Near the window stood Julian Dunwich the nephew, his dark hair unkempt, his posture a careful blend of arrogance and unease, his hands tucked behind his back, clenched at unseen tension. I arrived late, he admitted. I hadn't seen my uncle in months. I hesitated. We argued. A ripple of interest passed through the room. About? Lowell prompted. Julian's jaw tightened. He said I was reckless, that I had no claim to his fortune. Reckless, no claim. Eleanor studied him carefully. The words weren't a lie, but they weren't the whole truth either. And then there was Lillian Moore, the quiet companion to Lady Rosalind, a woman so easily overlooked that it seemed deliberate. Her fingers fidgeted at her sides, her gaze lowered, avoiding direct scrutiny. Eleanor noticed the way her eyes flickered toward the writing desk, toward the unlit fireplace. If something had been burned, it had been done hastily. You seem nervous, Miss Moore, Eleanor remarked. The woman flinched. Only unsettled, Miss Finch. This is all so tragic. And yet, in tragedy, people revealed themselves. Eleanor let the silence stretch, let the pressure of it settle over the room like thick smoke. Someone here had seen something, someone had taken something, and in the hollow spaces between their words, the truth waited to be found. Murder is rarely about the act itself, she murmured finally. It's about what came before it, the choices, the betrayals, the secrets someone was willing to kill to keep. Her gaze swept across the room, resting momentarily on the smudge of ink on the solicitor's cuff, the housekeeper's ash-streaked apron, the widow's trembling fingers, and the nephew's darting eyes. The pieces were there, scattered like shards of broken glass, and Eleanor Finch was very good at putting things back together. The game had begun. The village of Ravenshade had always been a place of quiet routines, a world where time moved at its own deliberate pace, until the murder. The great halls of Thornfield Manor now stood heavy with the weight of secrets, their once gleaming floors now dull beneath the steady trudge of investigators. Inspector Alden Graves had gathered them all in the drawing-room, his keen gaze shifting from one suspect to the next, but it was Miss Evangeline Harper, seated calmly by the fireplace, who truly understood the game being played. She knew the power of silence, of watching rather than speaking, and of letting the guilty weave their own noose. And tonight, as the embers in the hearth flickered low, she saw the threads of deception beginning to unravel. Lady Eleanor Montrose, the widow, was the first to break the silence, her hands clasped tightly together, her voice a careful balance between grief and restraint. My husband was working late, she murmured. I retired early. I didn't see him again after dinner. But Evangeline noticed the way her fingers trembled, the subtle way her gaze flickered toward the locked bureau by the window, the place where Lord Montrose had kept his private documents. Then there was Samuel Whittaker, The trusted valet who stood near the doorway, his posture rigid. "His lordship dismissed me earlier than usual last night," he admitted. "He said he wouldn't need anything more. A harmless detail, except for the fact that the brandy decanter on the desk, Montrose's nightly ritual, had remained untouched. If the valet had truly left early, then who had brought Montrose his final drink?" The soft rustle of fabric drew Evangeline's attention to Miss Lillian Gray, the lady's companion, her presence deliberately unassuming. Her hands toyed absently with the beaded handle of her handbag, a movement small enough to go unnoticed by most, but not by Evangeline. There was something inside, something she didn't want anyone to see, and when Inspector Graves turned his questioning to her, her voice was quiet, measured, yet not entirely steady. "I was in my room," she said. "I didn't hear anything," but she hadn't been in her room at all. Evangeline had seen the faint trace of mud on the hem of her dress, not the kind collected from a casual stroll, but thicker, clinging, as if she'd walked through damp earth recently disturbed. A burial site, perhaps. The solicitor, Mr. Percival Hargrove, was more composed, seated by the chessboard near the window, his fingers idly turning a knight over and over in his hand. He met the inspector's gaze without hesitation. "Lord Montrose and I had business to discuss." "Yes," he said. He was considering amendments to his will. Evangeline caught the flicker of something behind his eyes, the way his grip tightened ever so slightly on the chess piece. Considering was an interesting choice of words. Had Montrose agreed to the changes, had he refused, or had someone ensured he'd never have the chance? And then there was Julian Montrose, the heir, or at least he had been, until it was discovered that Lord Montrose had intended to leave a portion of his estate elsewhere. Julian stood by the window, his jaw tight, his fingers curled into his palm. "I had nothing to gain from his death," he said, too quickly. Evangeline didn't respond, merely tilted her head slightly. Nothing to gain, unless there had been a last-minute change to the will. Unless the inheritance had been slipping through his fingers, and what of the missing document? Lord Montrose had been writing something important before his death, but his desk was bare. The blotter still bore the faint indentations of a letter hastily removed, an unfinished confession, perhaps. A threat? A promise? The air in the room had grown heavier, the unspoken words pressing against the walls like shadows waiting to be noticed. The tea in the drawing room had been untouched. The curtains had been drawn when Montrose never drew them. The fireplace had been cleaned too thoroughly, as if something had been burned. Evangeline turned her attention back to Lady Eleanor, her delicate frame poised at the edge of her chair. The widow had been the first to speak, to explain, to direct suspicion elsewhere, but her mourning veil had been torn, a detail she had yet to explain. Had someone grabbed her in the dark? Had she fought back? And then, just as the clock struck 11, a gust of wind rattled the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, its voice long and mournful. The night pressed in around Thornfield Manor, holding its secrets tight. But Evangeline Harper knew one thing for certain. Someone in this room had killed Lord Montrose, and soon they would wish they hadn't. The estate of Briar Hollow was steeped in the kind of silence that comes only after a storm, the air thick with unspoken words, the furniture undisturbed, as though waiting for the next act to unfold. The drawing room, once a space of polite conversation and warm firelight, now carried the heavy scent of extinguished candles and something else, something metallic and sharp beneath the lavender sachets that perfumed the curtains. Miss Evelyn Ashford, her ever-present knitting needles clutched lightly in her hands, sat near the bay window where the light fell just right. She had not come for confrontation. Not yet. She had come to watch, to listen. Lady Margaret Halford, the late Sir Lionel's widow, sat poised yet brittle, as if the weight of grief had settled into her bones overnight. The argument was dreadful, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lionel and Charles, his brother, were shouting in the library. I didn't hear everything, but it was about the estate. Something about inheritance, a will. Her fingers tightened around the porcelain teacup, the tension in her grip betraying her carefully measured words. Evelyn nodded, absorbing every flicker of movement, every restrained breath. A contested will, a family at odds, a brother with something to gain. She glanced toward Charles Halford, who stood near the fireplace, his posture too rigid, his face unreadable, save for the telltale twitch of his jaw. Lionel was a stubborn man, Charles said, his voice measured, but there was an edge to it, something brittle beneath the surface. He wouldn't listen to reason, and what reason was that, Mr. Halford? Evelyn's voice was light, almost conversational. Charles hesitated, his fingers tapping absently against the marble mantelpiece. The land, he said finally. The estate is hemorrhaging funds. Lionel wouldn't sell, wouldn't change anything. It was reckless, a valid argument, except for the fact that Sir Lionel was dead before he could sign any new documents. A coincidence, or something far more deliberate. And then there was Beatrice Langley, the late Sir Lionel's secretary, a woman who had until now been a mere shadow in the household. But Evelyn had seen the small tells, the way Beatrice's hands trembled when she adjusted her cuffs, the way her eyes flickered too, quickly toward the writing desk where a small stack of telegrams lay. Evelyn sipped her tea, waiting for the moment to strike. "You received a telegram this morning, did you not?" Beatrice's spine went rigid. "A personal matter," she replied swiftly, too swiftly. Evelyn let the silence stretch between them, long enough for the weight of it to settle. Beatrice's fingers curled inward, her lips pressed into a thin line. Evelyn had seen that look before, a person desperate to keep a secret from slipping through their fingers. Lady Margaret shifted in her chair. "It's nothing surely," she said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. Evelyn simply watched as Beatrice's throat bobbed with a swallowed response. Then there was the missing letter. The fireplace had been swept, yet a faint trace of burnt parchment lingered in the air. Evelyn's eyes drifted to the desk, to the faint imprint of ink on the blotter, as if something had been hastily removed before it could be discovered. And though the words were faint, one stood out clearly, illegitimate. A cold realization settled over Evelyn. An unknown heir, a secret that could ruin the Halford legacy, a motive clear as day, if one knew where to look. And what of Frederick Hale, Sir Lionel's valet? He had been the last to see his master alive. Yet this morning he had been sweating under questioning, his answers too smooth, too well practiced. His coat had smelled of damp earth, and the soles of his boots had carried the distinct imprint of the freshly turned garden soil behind the estate. But what had been buried there? The clock on the mantel struck noon, the chime ringing hollow in the tense air. Evelyn sat back, her knitting needles clicking idly as she let the weight of the unspoken truths settle. The pieces were aligning, a desperate brother, a hidden child, a burned letter, a valet with too much to explain. The question was not simply who had killed Sir Lionel, but rather who had the most to lose if the truth came to light. And soon Evelyn knew the answer would reveal itself. The village of Ravenswood Hollow lay under a heavy veil of mist, the kind that clung to the cobbled streets and curled around the iron gates of the great estate at its heart. It was not merely the late autumn fog that thickened the air, but the weight of unspoken truths, of hidden fears buried beneath the propriety of fine tea and lace-curtained windows. The house itself, Wrenmore Manor, stood solemn and untouched, its gardens wilting under the shifting season, much like those who resided within. Miss Eleanor Graves, ever perceptive, strode through the overgrown pathway, the faint scent of damp earth and frost-kissed roses wrapping around her as she approached the lone figure among the flower-beds. Clara Whitmore, the lady's companion, was kneeling in the soil, her delicate fingers trembling as she plucked away the fading petals of an autumn rose. The gesture was careful, almost reverent, yet something about it felt unnatural, as if she were trying too hard to busy herself, to keep her hands from revealing something far less innocent. Eleanor's voice was smooth, deliberate. "A fine morning for gardening, Miss Whitmore." Clara started, her fingers tightening instinctively around the stem, a thorn pressing into her skin, though she did not seem to notice. "Miss Graves," her breath caught for the briefest of moments before she forced a smile. "I didn't hear you approach." Eleanor studied her closely. The girl was composed, but her eyes flickered too quickly, her breath was too measured, her forced nonchalance betraying something deeper. "You have a careful hand with these roses," Eleanor observed lightly, plucking a dying petal between gloved fingers. "It must be difficult to tend to them with the season changing." Clara hesitated, her gaze momentarily dropping to the dark soil beneath her nails. "It's just a matter of keeping them from wilting too soon," she murmured, but there was something in her voice, a note too practiced, too rehearsed. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, and yet some things wither before their time. Her words were gentle, yet they settled between them like a weight. Clara swallowed. "I suppose you've heard about Lord Everley." Eleanor met her gaze evenly. "I have." The name alone cast a long shadow. Lord Everley, found dead in his study, a half-written letter burned in the grate, a glass of brandy untouched at his side. A tragedy they called it, an unfortunate accident, but Eleanor had long stopped believing in accidents. Clara's hands fidgeted with her gardening shears. She was nervous. Eleanor did not press, not yet. Instead she let her voice soften. "And what of the telegrams you've been receiving?" A sharp intake of breath. Clara's grip faltered. "Telegrams?" Her voice was a whisper too light, too careful. "They're nothing, just letters from an old acquaintance. A family matter." Eleanor smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "Ah, family matters. They do have a way of complicating things, don't they?" Clara's gaze darted to the manor behind them, as if half expecting to see someone watching, or listening. She turned back to the roses, plucking at a leaf that did not need removing. "I really don't know anything about Lord Everley," she said, though the slight tremor in her voice told another story. Eleanor let the silence stretch, watching how Clara's hands stilled, how her shoulders stiffened beneath her shawl. There was something she wasn't saying, not yet. As Eleanor turned to leave, she paused, her eyes flickering to the faint imprint of a boot in the soil, slightly deeper than the others, leading toward the back of the estate, a misplaced step. A moment of hesitation, captured in earth. The fog swirled around her ankles as she stepped past it, her mind weaving the fragments together. A nervous girl, a burned letter, a hidden telegram, a boot print where it did not belong. The pieces were scattered like petals in the wind, but Eleanor Graves had always known how to gather them. The truth, she knew, was already waiting to be uncovered. The fog in Ravenswood Hollow had settled thick and low, curling through the streets like an old spectre. It was the kind of mist that swallowed sound, that blurred the edges of things, making shadows seem deeper and secrets harder to trace. Eleanor Graves, ever the quiet observer, walked briskly down the winding path leading to Ashton Hollow, a small, unassuming cottage nestled between overgrown hedgerows. The house was too modest for a man of Julian Ashford's influence, but then again, deception often thrived in simplicity. The door was already ajar when she knocked, opening just enough for Ashford's sharp, calculating eyes to peer through. "Miss Graves," he said smoothly, his voice carefully measured, "an unexpected visit. I trust you haven't lost your way." His words were polite, but his fingers tightened around the edge of the door, as if debating whether to let her in or shut her out entirely. Eleanor stepped forward without hesitation. "Not at all, Mr. Ashford. I simply thought a conversation might be illuminating." There was the briefest flicker of something behind his eyes before he pushed the door open wider, gesturing her inside. The parlor was sparse, the scent of old paper and ink lingering in the dimly lit space. A fireplace crackled softly, but the warmth did not reach Ashford's expression. He moved with the ease of a man who had spent years masking discomfort behind control, but today, Eleanor noted that control was slipping just at the edges. She let the silence stretch between them before speaking. The village has been buzzing since Lord Vance's untimely demise. A tragedy, wouldn't you say? Ashford's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. Tragic indeed, but hardly surprising. He was a man with many entanglements. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Entanglements, yes. Some financial, some more personal. A pause, a fractional moment where the crack appeared. His fingers twitched. I wouldn't know, he said too quickly, moving toward a side table where a half-empty glass of brandy rested. He lifted it but did not drink. Surely you're not suggesting I had anything to do with his passing? Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Of course not, Mr. Ashford, but I do wonder about a certain letter. She took a slow step forward, a letter that suggested Lord Vance was not the rightful heir to his fortune, a letter that, if made public, would have sent quite a few dealings into disarray. Ashford's grip on the glass tightened just enough for the faintest creak to sound. He exhaled sharply. You seem to have done your research, Miss Graves. But speculation is a dangerous thing, especially when there are other forces at play. His voice was steady, but the muscles in his jaw had stiffened. Indeed, Eleanor agreed, her gaze drifting to the edge of the desk, where a corner of parchment peeked from beneath a stack of books, aged yellowed at the edges, a broken wax seal glinting faintly in the firelight. A discarded remnant, forgotten in haste. I imagine it must have been quite distressing to learn that everything you'd planned for was built on a lie. A beat of silence. Then slowly, Ashford set the glass down. And what is it exactly that you believe I planned for? Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That, Mr. Ashford, is what I intend to uncover. The flames in the hearth crackled, the firelight casting long distorted shadows against the walls. Outside, the mist curled tighter around the village, pressing in as if listening, watching, waiting. And so was Eleanor Graves. The village of Black Hollow seemed eerily quiet as Eleanor Graves stepped out of Julian Ashford's cottage, her mind tangled in the weight of the conversation she had just had. A thread had come loose, but how many more were waiting to unravel? Ashford had spoken carefully, offering just enough to seem cooperative, but never quite enough to be honest. Money, reputation, the shadow of a hidden heir, all potent motives, all dangerous when tangled with fear. As Eleanor moved through the cobblestone streets, her gaze flickered over the familiar faces of villagers, each one carrying their own secrets, their own whispers of guilt. She had seen it in the half-burned letters, in the anxious flickers of glances, in the silences that stretched too long to be natural. Marian Wakefield, ever the nervous widow, had too much to lose. Her trembling hands and overly polite smiles reeked of hidden knowledge. Rupert Henshaw, the banker with a reputation for ruthless deals, had been too quick to dismiss the idea of any financial dispute, his voice a little too controlled. And then there was Beatrice Hale, young, jittery, her words always stopping just shy of something important, something that might ruin her. Every single one of them had a motive, some for greed, some for survival, some for revenge. But Eleanor was beginning to sense that the real truth ran deeper, a secret that did not belong to one person alone, but was woven through the village itself, a web of long-buried lies and silent conspiracies. She paused in the village square, her eyes narrowing as the late afternoon light bathed the town in a golden haze. Beneath the soft glow, the tension in the air was suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that came before something shattered. The kind of quiet where people held their breath, hoping the past would stay buried. At Wren House, a grand but aging estate that had seen far too many secrets whispered through its halls, Inspector James Alden was pacing the study-turned-command center, his sharp gaze fixed on the papers scattered across the desk. A cigarette dangled from his lips, its ash falling unnoticed onto a pile of handwritten statements. "It's all too neat," he muttered, tapping a document with his knuckles. We have our timelines, we have our alibis, but something is wrong. Eleanor settled into a chair across from him, her expression unreadable. Then tell me, Inspector, where does the truth slip through? Alden exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Henshaw claims he never saw Lord Vance after their meeting that morning, but we both know Vance didn't let go of a grudge that easily. Wakefield swears she was home all afternoon, but her maid says she left the house for at least an hour. And then there's Beatrice. His voice lowered slightly. She says she was at the post office when the body was found, but the postmaster only remembers seeing her on her way back. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, which means she was unaccounted for when it happened. Exactly. Alden's gaze sharpened. And yet, none of these statements are outright lies. That's the part that bothers me. They've all been crafted too well, just enough truth woven in to make them believable. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. It's not just one of them, Eleanor, it's all of them. Her pulse quickened. You think it was planned? Alden nodded grimly. Not just a crime of passion, not just a dispute over money. This was coordinated. Someone, maybe more than one person, knew this was coming. A slow chill settled over Eleanor as she glanced at the stack of notes, the careful lies, the impossible neatness of the timeline. A village like Black Hollow had a long memory, and it knew how to keep its ghosts hidden, but not forever. She met Alden's gaze, her voice steady. Then it's time to find the one thread they forgot to cut. And outside, beneath the golden glow of dusk, Black Hollow held its breath. The evening air clung to Eleanor Graves like a second skin, thick with the damp scent of earth and roses wilting beneath the weight of autumn's slow decay. She pulled her coat tighter as she stepped onto the cobbled path leading to Windermere House, its grand yet neglected facade rising in the moonlight like the hushed breath of a forgotten spectre. The house had stood for over a century, its secrets sealed behind ivy-clad walls, and tonight, she intended to pry them loose. Somewhere in the distance, a fox screamed, a sound eerily human in the quiet of the night. The wind whispered through the trees, a gentle but persistent warning. Still, she pressed on. Her knock echoed into the silence, the weight of it stretching the moment. A pause longer than necessary, before the heavy oak door groaned open. Charles Montgomery stood in the dim glow of the lantern, his sharp eyes betraying a flicker of something unreadable, before he masked it with practiced ease. "Miss Graves," he murmured, his voice too measured, too careful. "A late visit. How unexpected." But Eleanor had learned long ago that nothing was truly unexpected in a place like this. "I was in the area," she said smoothly, stepping past him without invitation. The scent of old books, fading smoke, and something more elusive, something bitter, metallic, lingered in the air. Her gloved fingers grazed the dust-laden sideboard, pausing where an oval frame had once rested. The imprint was still visible, stark against the polished wood. "You've redecorated." Montgomery shut the door with an audible click, the sound final. "People change, so do houses." She turned, her gaze sweeping the parlor. Dim candlelight flickered against dark-paneled walls, casting uneasy shadows that stretched and shifted like silent witnesses. The grand piano in the corner stood untouched, its surface dull beneath a layer of dust, and there, on the side table, a small half-empty glass. Brandy, a drink Montgomery had always despised. Drinking alone, she mused, watching the way his fingers tightened slightly. Odd considering you never developed a taste for it. He hesitated only a second before offering a thin, humorless smile. "One acquires new habits." Eleanor tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "Or one covers old sins." The words settled between them, heavy and deliberate. The clock on the mantel marked the passage of time with an almost accusatory rhythm. Montgomery held her gaze for a fraction too long before exhaling slowly. "Why are you here, Miss Graves?" She stepped forward, glancing at the glass before meeting his eyes. "Tell me, Charles, when was the last time you saw Eleanor Redfern?" The reaction was subtle, a slight shift of weight, a flicker in his expression, but Eleanor had spent years studying the language of deception. I told the inspector. I hadn't seen her in months, and yet Eleanor tapped the rim of the brandy glass. Her bracelet was found in the garden just yesterday. A flicker of something shock, fear, crossed his face before vanishing behind his carefully composed mask. It means nothing, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Eleanor smiled, slow and knowing. Perhaps not, but I find it curious that every piece of evidence pointing to her last known whereabouts somehow leads back to you. Montgomery exhaled through his nose, the weight of the conversation pressing against him. You've always been too clever for your own good, Miss Graves, and you've always underestimated me. The silence stretched, the old house seeming to hold its breath. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Montgomery's fingers ghosted over the polished wood of the sideboard, stopping just short of where the missing frame had been. You should be careful where you dig, he said quietly. Some secrets are better left buried. Eleanor's lips curled at the edges, a whisper of a smile that never reached her eyes. Not this one. She turned, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way toward the door. Every step felt heavier, the weight of something unseen pressing down. As she reached for the handle, Montgomery spoke again, his voice quieter now. She was here that night. Eleanor stilled, the admission hung in the air like a held breath. I never said she wasn't, he continued, the words carefully measured. I said I hadn't seen her in months. Eleanor turned, her pulse quickening. Then where is she now? Montgomery's gaze flickered toward the darkened staircase at the end of the hall, barely perceptible, but Eleanor caught it. A slow chill crept up her spine. The night was far from over, and neither was this mystery. The candlelight flickered against the dark-paneled walls of Ashcombe Manor, casting elongated shadows that seemed to breathe with the night itself. Eleanor Ashford sat in the parlor, her hands folded neatly over the fragile scrap of paper that had changed everything. The words were barely legible now, the ink smudged from time and fire, but their meaning still loomed large. If the rightful claim is proven, all shall be undone. The embers in the hearth crackled softly, a sound too small for the weight it carried. A letter like this could not have simply vanished by accident. No, someone had destroyed it with intent. And yet, like all secrets buried in haste, it had left behind just enough to betray its existence. She exhaled slowly, her gaze lifting to the heavy portrait above the fireplace. Reginald Whitmore, the late master of Ashcombe. His cold painted eyes seemed to mock her. He had been dead nearly 3 months, his body found slumped over his desk, a crystal glass of brandy at his side. The initial verdict had been natural causes, a weak heart, they had said. But Eleanor had never believed in convenient deaths, and the manor had begun whispering its own suspicions. The servants talked in hushed tones, the villagers muttered when they thought no one could hear. And then there was the tea. Reginald had been a man of precise habits. Whiskey, every evening at precisely 9. Yet on the night of his death, it had not been whiskey in his glass. It had been tea. A deliberate switch, a calculated decision. Eleanor had questioned the house staff, the remaining family, even the postmaster about any unusual correspondences Reginald might have received in his final weeks. A pattern had emerged, fragments of burned letters turning up in the oddest places, the ashtray in the study, the scullery drain, even beneath the floorboards of the east wing. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase something, and now, as she turned the scorched paper in her hands, she knew exactly what: the inheritance. Reginald had not been the only heir. Across from her, Rupert Alden leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his gaze sharp, despite the casual posture. "You think this is more than just a coincidence," he murmured, watching her carefully. Eleanor tilted her head. "I think Reginald knew something he wasn't meant to know. and I think someone killed him before he could act on it." Rupert's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "And let me guess, you suspect everyone." She ignored the jest. "Tell me, Rupert, where exactly were you the night Reginald died?" A flicker so brief it might have been imagined crossed his face, then he exhaled through his nose, amusement replaced by something colder. "You've already asked me that, and yet I don't recall receiving a satisfactory answer." Rupert leaned forward slightly, the firelight casting deep shadows over his face. "You really believe one of us poisoned him, and not just that, but somehow managed to switch his drink without him noticing?" "Yes," she said simply, "I do." A muscle tensed in his jaw. "Then you're playing a dangerous game, Eleanor." She held his gaze. "So are you." The fire crackled again, a log shifting, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck midnight, its chimes slow and deliberate. The walls of Ashcombe Manor had held their secrets for generations. But Eleanor knew the truth was clawing its way to the surface, as inevitable as the tide. A noise in the hallway, a soft shuffle, both she and Rupert turned sharply. The manor had been empty for hours. No servants remained at this hour, and yet someone was there. Eleanor stood slowly, her pulse steady, but her breath shallow. "We're not alone." Rupert rose beside her, his hand hovering near the silver letter opener on the desk. The door creaked open, and the past finally stepped forward to claim what had always belonged to it. The village of Ravenshade had always been a place where secrets festered beneath its picturesque facade, where the cobblestone streets whispered with unseen betrayals, and the past clung to its people like a ghost they refused to name. The morning air carried the faint scent of damp earth and old parchment, and beneath the towering elms of the village square, two men stood locked in a confrontation that had been brewing long before the first whispers of scandal began to stir. Lady Eleanor Vale watched from the comfort of a shaded bench, her embroidery needle slipping effortlessly through the fabric in her lap, but her mind was elsewhere, sharp, observant, waiting for the moment when tempers would fray enough to let the truth slip through the cracks. Across the square, Nathaniel Harrington, a solicitor whose name was spoken only in hushed, wary tones, shifted uneasily as he faced the man before him. Jonathan Blackwell, heir to the formidable Blackwell fortune, stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his voice a low, seething whisper. "You had no business meddling, Harrington. The estate was settled, the matter was closed." Harrington's lips curled in the faintest smile, his hands clasped behind his back as if he found the entire conversation mildly amusing. "Was it?" he murmured, tilting his head. "Or did you simply hope no one would dig deep enough to find what should never have been buried?" A muscle twitched in Jonathan's jaw, his breath coming through gritted teeth. That letter should have stayed lost. "Ah," Harrington mused, his voice deliberately calm, like a predator toying with prey. "So you do admit it existed?" Jonathan's eyes darkened, his fingers flexing as if restraining the impulse to strike. "You're playing a dangerous game." "And yet," Harrington said smoothly, "you're the one losing." Eleanor's fingers stilled against the embroidery hoop. The village had been rife with speculation since the Blackwell patriarch, Lord Edwin Blackwell, had been found slumped over his desk, his glass of brandy untouched, his lips tinged an unnatural shade of blue. The official cause had been a sudden heart failure, expected, even for a man of his age. But the letter changed everything. It had resurfaced in pieces, scattered and half-burned, as though someone had tried to erase its existence, but had been interrupted before they could finish the job. And now, even in its fragmented state, its meaning was clear. There was another heir, someone whose claim to the Blackwell estate was far stronger than Jonathan's, someone who, if the truth were ever revealed, would leave him with nothing. Eleanor had spent the last few days watching, listening, waiting. She knew the moment the letter had been discovered, the village had begun to unravel. The Blackwells were powerful, but power could only shield one from so much when the foundation beneath them had already begun to rot. Everyone had something to lose, everyone had a reason to lie. The air between Jonathan and Harrington crackled with unspoken threats, their words masked with civility, but sharpened with danger. "You overestimate your position," Jonathan said at last, his voice quieter now deadly. "This isn't about business, Harrington. This is about survival. And I suggest you start considering your own." "Is that a warning?" Harrington asked, his expression unchanged. "Or a promise?" Jonathan didn't answer. He only turned sharply, striding away from the square, his boots striking the cobblestones with a force that betrayed the storm raging beneath his carefully maintained facade. Eleanor watched him go, her gaze lingering. He was afraid, and not just of losing the estate. He was afraid of something far worse. She glanced back toward Harrington, whose posture remained relaxed, though his eyes flickered with something unreadable as he turned and walked away in the opposite direction. The village square fell silent again, but the tension had not lifted, it had only grown heavier. Eleanor exhaled slowly, tucking her embroidery away, rising from the bench as she smoothed down her skirts. The truth, she knew, had a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply one tried to bury it. And Ravenshade, for all its charm, had never been a place where secrets stayed hidden for long. The village of Blackwood Hollow had always been a place of quiet routines, where time moved at a measured pace, and the past whispered through the ivy-clad walls of its ancient estates. But tonight, there was a heaviness in the air, something thick and cloying, something that settled in the bones like an unspoken warning. Lady Evelyn Hargrove sat on the wrought-iron bench near the square, her hands delicately occupied with an unfinished embroidery piece, though her mind was elsewhere, unraveling the strands of a puzzle that had only just begun to take shape. Across from her, under the flickering glow of a street lantern, two figures stood locked in tense conversation: Julian Whitmore, heir to the crumbling Whitmore estate, and Arthur Sterling, the solicitor whose mere presence in Blackwood Hollow sent ripples through its stagnant waters. Julian's posture was rigid, his breath uneven, his fingers clenched at his sides, as though grasping at control he no longer had. "You shouldn't have come back, Sterling," he said, his voice a taut whisper laced with unspoken threats. "There was nothing left to dig up. Is that what you tell yourself?" Sterling's voice was smooth, almost amused, yet there was something sharp beneath it. "That the past will stay buried as long as no one looks too closely." A muscle twitched in Julian's jaw, but he did not answer. He couldn't. Evelyn's eyes lingered on the scene, her needle hovering mid-stitch as she pieced together what she already knew. The letter had changed everything. Found tucked behind the false backing of an old portrait, its parchment brittle with age, its ink smudged but still damning. It spoke of a secret inheritance, a claim that threatened to unseat Julian from the very estate he had fought to preserve. But more than that, it suggested betrayal, the kind that left behind ghosts, the kind that never truly faded. And now, in the wake of its discovery, Blackwood Hollow found itself tangled in a web of half-truths and concealed motives, each more dangerous than the last. Julian exhaled sharply, his eyes darting to the few stragglers who lingered near the shops, as if wary of being overheard. "You've stirred enough trouble," he hissed. "You should have left it alone. You think this is about me?" Sterling's smirk faded, his voice turned. "Someone killed Charles Whitmore, and if you think it was just an accident, then you're either blind or desperate." The words hung between them like a weight. Julian swallowed hard, his pulse visible in the tension of his throat. "I had nothing to do with that." "Then why burn the letter?" Silence. A long stretched moment where the only sound was the distant toll of the church bell marking the hour. Julian didn't answer. He didn't have to. His body spoke for him. The nervous twitch of his fingers, the way his gaze flickered to the cobblestones as if searching for an escape. Evelyn's lips curled slightly. Guilt was always easy to spot, but desperation, that was the true key to unlocking the truth. Julian wasn't just worried. He was afraid, and fear, she knew, could drive men to dangerous decisions. The night deepened, the wind carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. As Evelyn's thoughts drifted to something she had overheard earlier outside the apothecary, a name whispered in hushed tones, Margaret Wakefield. A woman who had long been a shadow in Blackwood Hollow, who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a forgotten footnote in the Whitmore family's history. But now her name had resurfaced, entangled in murmured speculation, spoken with just enough unease to suggest she knew something no one wanted to acknowledge. Evelyn let the thought settle, her fingers tightening around the embroidery frame. The pieces were coming together, slowly but surely. Julian's desperation, the burned letter, the death that had been conveniently ruled an accident. There was a pattern, hidden beneath the dust of old sins and whispered regrets. And soon, whether the people of Blackwood Hollow were ready for it or not, the truth would surface. Because in places like this, secrets never truly stayed buried, they only waited for the right moment to be unearthed. The narrow path to the vicarage was slick with the remnants of an evening drizzle, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and fading lavender. Lady Evelyn Hargrove moved with careful precision, her heels pressing softly into the moss-lined stone, her mind already sifting through the tangled threads of deception that had led her here. It had been 4 days since the sudden shocking death at Ashwick Manor, 4 days of whispers in drawing rooms, of veiled glances exchanged behind lace curtains. She had spent that time gathering fragments, listening rather than speaking, watching as the fabric of propriety stretched thin over the uneasy truths no one dared to acknowledge. But tonight, she was here for something more, the final piece. The vicarage stood solemnly at the village's edge, half consumed by shadows cast from the gnarled old yew trees that lined its modest garden. A single candle burned in the study window, flickering against the heavy drapes. Reverend Alistair Crowley was a man known for his quiet wisdom, a keeper of the town's past as much as its faith. He had buried secrets just as often as he had buried the dead, and Lady Evelyn intended to unearth at least one of them tonight. She knocked, firm but unhurried. Footsteps echoed within, then the door creaked open to reveal the vicar himself, silver-haired, his sharp eyes betraying a wariness that had nothing to do with the late hour. "Lady Evelyn," he greeted, stepping aside to admit her, "I did not expect company." "Few ever do when the past comes calling," she replied smoothly, slipping into the warmth of his study. Books lined the walls in towering, dust-laden shelves. A stack of aged hymnals sat beside an open ledger on his desk, the ink barely dry. The smell of old parchment and candle wax filled the air. "I will not take much of your time, Reverend, but there is something I must ask." He hesitated, but only briefly, before motioning her to sit. "Then ask." She folded her hands in her lap, her gaze never wavering. "The Blackwood family, you have served this parish long enough to know their history, their sins." A flicker of unease crossed his face, but he said nothing. "I believe the recent tragedy at Ashwick Manor is tied to something much older, something long buried." His fingers tensed against the arms of his chair. "What are you suggesting?" "That there was a child," she said, her voice even but deliberate, "one the Blackwoods never acknowledged. One who should have inherited everything." The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rattling the ivy against the glass. The vicar exhaled slowly, his hands folding together, as if in silent prayer. "There were stories," he admitted at last, his voice no louder than the rustling of paper. "A birth never recorded, a name never spoken, and that name." He hesitated, then leaned forward as if the walls themselves had ears. "Margaret Ellsworth." The name sent a shiver through her. Margaret Ellsworth, housemaid, governess, a woman whose presence had always been overshadowed by the grandeur of the Blackwoods. Always there, but never truly seen. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. She was not just a servant, was she? The vicar's gaze darkened. "No," he said quietly, "she was the rightful heir." Evelyn's breath slowed. If Margaret had known the truth, if she had spent her life in the shadows of a fortune stolen from her, What might she have done when she learned the final betrayal? Had she uncovered her own birthright too late? Had someone silenced her before she could claim it? The candle flickered, casting elongated shadows along the walls, stretching like grasping fingers. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, restless and hungry, and Evelyn was ready to face it. Because in Blackwood Hollow, secrets never stayed buried forever. The cold night air clung to Lady Evelyn Hargrove as she stepped from the vicarage, the scent of damp earth and smouldering firewood lingering in the air. The conversation with Reverend Crowley had confirmed her suspicions. There was an heir, one the Blackwood family had buried in whispers and lies. But who? And why now, after all these years, had the past clawed its way back into the present? She wrapped her coat tighter around her as she walked, her mind a whirlwind of names and faces, of hushed conversations and fleeting glances exchanged when they thought no one was watching. Margaret Ellsworth. A name that had been spoken too softly for too long. A name that, if truly tied to the Blackwood fortune, had the power to unravel everything. She needed answers, and there was only one place left to find them: Ashwick Manor. The estate loomed in the darkness, its ivy-clad walls absorbing the moonlight, its grand windows dark as empty eyes watching her approach. Inside, the housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, was waiting. A woman of rigid posture and sharper instincts, she had served the Blackwoods for decades. But Evelyn knew even the most loyal servants carried their own secrets. When the heavy oak door creaked open, Mrs. Bellamy's gaze flickered with recognition, and something else: hesitation. "Lady Evelyn," she said, stepping aside to let her in. "You shouldn't be here at this hour." "And yet," Evelyn replied, moving past her, "here I am." The drawing-room smelled of old leather and dust, the remnants of a dying fire, casting long shadows across the furniture. Mrs. Bellamy remained by the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You know why I'm here." The housekeeper's expression remained unreadable, but Evelyn caught the way her fingers twitched. "I don't know what you mean, my lady." Evelyn smiled, slow and knowing. "I think you do." A pause, heavy and loaded. Then with a sigh, Mrs. Bellamy walked to the sideboard, her movements careful, deliberate. "There was a letter," she said at last, her voice low. "Sir Reginald wrote it before he passed. I never read it, but I know it was important." "Is it now?" "Gone," she said simply. "Frederick took it the night Sir Reginald died. I saw him, hands trembling, rifling through the desk. He burned it before morning." Evelyn's breath hitched. "What did it say?" "I don't know," Mrs. Bellamy admitted, looking past Evelyn as though seeing the ghosts of the past in the dimly lit room. But whatever was in it, it terrified him. A shiver crawled up Evelyn's spine. A hidden heir, a burned letter, a family willing to erase the truth to protect their legacy. The pieces were falling into place, and she was close, so close to the final revelation. But something else gnawed at her, something deeper than secrets and scandal. Someone had killed Sir Reginald, and now, knowing what she knew, Evelyn was certain of one thing: whoever had done it wasn't finished yet. The game wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The dim glow of the gaslight flickered as Lady Eleanor Lockwood stepped through the stone archway of Blackmere House, the weight of the evening pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. The air carried the scent of damp earth and withered roses, the gardens beyond lying in eerie silence, untouched by the usual whisper of the wind. It was as if the house itself was waiting, watching. Eleanor had spent years unraveling the deceptions of the powerful, but tonight, the truth felt closer than ever, just a breath away. The parlor was empty, save for the lingering scent of damp oak and forgotten whispers, but she knew she wasn't alone. Shadows shifted in the corridors, and the silence of the house felt unnatural, thick with something unspoken. The letter, it had resurfaced, an artifact of betrayal, a dangerous thread that, if pulled, could unravel everything the Blackmere family had built. Her heels barely made a sound as she crossed the grand hall, her mind sorting through the tangled web of lies that had led her here. Blackmere's inheritance had been a whispered topic among the elite, an unspoken truth that had bred caution in the town, an unease that no one dared acknowledge. Henry Blackmere had grown increasingly desperate in the weeks leading up to his brother's death. Too desperate, and desperation, she knew, was a treacherous thing. It could make men reckless, make them blind to the very mistakes that would seal their downfall. Miss Grace Whitmore, the ever-watchful housekeeper, had insisted she had seen Henry burning papers in the dead of night, his hands trembling, his face ghostly pale in the firelight. A simple act, easily dismissed, until one realized what those pages might have contained. And then there was the tea, a detail so mundane, so seemingly insignificant, that it had almost slipped through the cracks. Henry had never been one for tea. Brandy had been his comfort, his companion. And yet, on the night of his brother's death, he had insisted on making tea himself. The study door creaked open as she stepped inside, the air thick with the ghost of old tobacco smoke and ink-stained secrets. The room had remained untouched since Henry Blackmere had been found, his lifeless body slumped over the mahogany desk, a single candle flickering beside him. The brandy sat at his elbow, the glass still full. Poison, they had said. A slow, insidious kind, but the more Eleanor uncovered, the more she realized that poison had not been the only weapon at play. Fear had been just as deadly. The letter, the sudden death, the fire in the hearth that had burned just long enough to destroy evidence but not long enough to erase the truth. Everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. But there was always a flaw, a thread that when pulled, would unravel everything. A sound behind her, just the faintest shift in the silence. Her breath stilled. The shadows in the hallway weathered, as if something or someone had moved just beyond her sight. Slowly, deliberately, she turned. Her heart beat steady, despite the rush of adrenaline. But there was no one there, only the flickering candlelight casting uneasy shapes across the paneled walls. Yet she wasn't fooled. Someone was watching, someone who knew the truth. Stepping back into the corridor, she allowed a small knowing smile to touch her lips. She had spent her life hunting shadows, peeling back the layers of deception, exposing the rotten core beneath the polished veneer. And this was no different. The game was nearing its end, and Eleanor had never lost a game of shadows before. The heavy drapes of Ashford Manor cast long shadows over the drawing room, their deep crimson folds stirring faintly in the evening breeze. Lady Helena Ashford stood by the marble fireplace, her gloved hand resting on the mantel, her posture deceptively composed. But beneath the surface, a storm brewed, an unspoken tension rippling through the air. Across from her, the gathered suspects sat in stiff silence, the weight of anticipation pressing down on them like a vice. Lord Edwin Blackthorne, ever the master of his own composure, reclined in his chair, though his fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the armrest. Miss Vivienne Harrow, pale and trembling, twisted the handkerchief in her lap with such force it was a wonder the delicate lace did not tear. And then there was Mr. Felix Ravenscroft, dark-eyed, impassive, but with a subtle sharpness in his gaze, as if calculating every possible outcome before it unfolded. Inspector Ambrose Vale, standing by the heavy oak doors, cleared his throat and stepped forward, his presence a quiet authority that only heightened the unease in the room. In his hand he held a small singed fragment of parchment. "I believe we all understand the gravity of what has been found," he said, his voice measured but laced with an undercurrent of finality. Slowly, deliberately, he passed the fragment to Lady Helena, who unfolded it with a precision that betrayed her own sense of urgency. The parchment bore the remnants of carefully penned words, blackened by fire, but not entirely lost to the flames. "The true heir," she read aloud, her voice as sharp as cut glass. "Should evidence be presented, the estate shall be restored to its rightful." She paused, glancing up. The rest of the sentence had been obliterated, but the implication was clear. Someone in this very room had been living a lie, their claim to Ashford Manor built on a deception now teetering on the brink of exposure. A stifling silence followed, then ever so subtly, movements betrayed them. Miss Harrow shifted in her seat, her throat working as if swallowing a confession she dared not speak. Lord Blackthorn's fingers stilled against the armrest, his gaze darkening. Mr. Ravenscroft, unshaken, merely tilted his head, watchful, predatory. "This letter," Lady Helena continued, "is the key to everything. A declaration that someone with a rightful claim, was meant to inherit Ashford Manor, yet that truth was buried, and someone in this room ensured it stayed that way." Miss Harrow let out a strangled breath. "This is madness," she murmured, though her voice trembled. Surely this letter proves nothing." But the weight of the moment suggested otherwise. Inspector Vale stepped forward once more. "On the contrary, Miss Harrow, it proves handbag," her gaze flickering between the others as though gauging the temperature of the room. At the far end, Henry Lennox leaned against the mantel, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, though the slight tension in his jaw betrayed something deeper beneath his polished exterior. Inspector Caldwell cleared his throat, breaking the silence like the first drop of rain on dry ground. "Lady Evangeline," he said, measured and firm, "you've called us here because you claim to have uncovered something crucial about Lord Ashbourne's death." Her lips curled in the barest hint of a smile. "Uncovered," she mused, her voice smooth as silk yet edged like a blade. "No, Inspector, I've merely noticed what was always in plain sight, if one knew where to look." She let her words settle like a trap closing around unsuspecting prey. "We've spoken of that evening, of who was where and what was said, but what interests me is not what was stated, but what was carefully omitted." Edgar stiffened. "If you're implying—" "I imply nothing," she interrupted smoothly, eyes locking onto his with the weight of certainty. "But I do find it curious that you were so insistent on preparing Lord Ashbourne's tea that evening, Edgar. A task you've never shown interest in before." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "It was merely a courtesy, was it?" Evangeline tilted her head. "Because I happen to know that Lord Ashbourne despised tea. He preferred brandy, something you were well aware of, and yet you ensured he had that cup in hand before retiring to his study, where he was later found." Florence let out a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around her handbag. "This is absurd," she muttered, but the tremor in her voice did not go unnoticed. "Is it?" Evangeline's gaze shifted. "Florence, you claimed you were at the post office that afternoon, sending a letter to your aunt, and yet," she held up a small folded slip of paper, "I took the liberty of inquiring with the postmaster. No such letter was ever sent." Florence's face drained of color. "That's impossible, is it?" Evangeline's voice was a whisper now, threading its way into the cracks of the room. "Or were you there to retrieve something instead? A letter perhaps, one that might have detailed Lord Ashbourne's true intentions regarding the estate." Henry's lips parted as if to interject, but Evangeline turned to him before he could speak. "And you, Mr. Lennox, arriving shortly before tea, meeting with Lord Ashbourne under the guise of legal matters, you claim you left soon after, yet the housekeeper saw you lingering near his study long after your supposed departure. What were you waiting for?" The silence was thick, suffocating. The air in the room seemed to shrink, pressing in around them. Edgar shifted in his seat, a bead of sweat slipping down his temple. Florence's fingers trembled. Henry's expression darkened, his grip tightening over his crossed arms. Evangeline leaned forward, her voice like a whisper of wind before a storm. "You all had something to hide. The question is, who had the most to lose?" Inspector Caldwell stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the gathered suspects. "I believe Lady Evangeline has made her point, and I suspect that by the end of this evening, we will have our answer." And as the clock on the mantel struck the hour, its chime breaking the charged silence, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The heavy silence inside Greythorn Manor was thick enough to smother a breath. Candles flickered in their sconces, casting long jagged shadows across the dark panelled walls. Lady Eleanor Ravenscroft sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, her delicate fingers drumming softly against the carved wood, her expression one of serene control. Across from her Martin Ashford stood stiffly, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Beside him, Vivienne Holloway perched on the edge of her seat, her usual composure betraying a flicker of unease as she cast fleeting glances toward the others. At the far end of the room, Giles Montgomery leaned against the bookshelf, the dim light barely catching the tautness in his jaw. Inspector Alden surveyed them all with practiced patience, his presence a quiet weight in the charged room. Eleanor let the silence stretch before she finally spoke, her voice soft yet deliberate. "It's a terrible thing, isn't it, to feel so at odds with those you once trusted, to find suspicion lurking in every shadow." She tilted her head, her gaze resting on Martin. "But what truly fascinates me is desperation, Mr. Ashford. What drives a man to act against his own better judgment?" Martin's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I don't know what you mean." Eleanor's lips curled in a faint smile. "Oh, I think you do." She folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Much has been said about Lord Ravenscroft's death, about the inheritance, the business dealings, the debts, but there is one thing that keeps troubling me." Her gaze flickered toward Vivienne, who stiffened. "Miss Holloway, you claimed the letters you sent that morning were personal in nature, nothing to do with the estate, nothing to do with my late husband." She leaned forward slightly. "And yet the postmaster recalls you leaving in such haste, clutching a letter as though your very life depended on it. Strange, wouldn't you say?" Vivienne's lips parted, but no sound came. She shifted uncomfortably. It was a private matter." "Of course," Eleanor agreed smoothly, "but not, I suspect, as private as you would have us believe." She let that settle before turning her attention to Giles. "And you, Mr. Montgomery, you were the last to see Lord Ravenscroft alive, weren't you?" Giles lifted a brow but remained silent. Eleanor's voice lowered, the firelight reflecting in her sharp gaze. "You said you spoke briefly, exchanged pleasantries before you left, but I find it interesting that the housekeeper heard voices raised in anger, a dispute over something pressing." Her eyes flickered with something cold and knowing. "You always did know more than you let on, didn't you?" Giles shifted, his jaw tightening further, but still, he said nothing. Eleanor exhaled, a quiet amusement dancing at the edges of her tone. "This is the problem, you see. When people lie, they only tell half a story, and I despise unfinished tales." Her gaze returned to Martin. "You, Mr. Ashford, had the most to gain, didn't you? Lord Ravenscroft was going to revise the estate's dealings, leaving you with little to call your own. And yet, when his body was discovered, it was you who took it upon yourself to rifle through his desk before the authorities arrived." Martin's face paled. "That's not, I wasn't, but you were," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "And that is where your misstep lies." Inspector Alden finally spoke, his tone measured. "Perhaps it's time, Mr. Ashford, that you told us exactly what you were looking for." The room was silent, save for the soft hiss of the fire. The walls of Greythorn had long held their secrets, but tonight the truth would come to light. The tension inside Hawthorne Hall was suffocating, a thick, invisible force pressing against the walls as the flickering candlelight cast restless shadows across the room. Lady Evelyn Sterling sat composed in her high-backed chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression betraying nothing. Across from her, Edward Langley stood rigid, his fingers twitching at his sides, while Margaret Bellamy's knuckles were white against the armrest of her chair, her breath shallow, eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors as if contemplating escape. Near the mantel, Julian Warwick leaned casually, but the set of his jaw and the tightness in his shoulders betrayed his unease. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending embers spiraling into the air, their glow illuminating the thin smile that played at the corners of Lady Evelyn's lips. "Each of you," she began, her voice deceptively soft, "holds a piece of the puzzle, but not one of you holds the whole truth." She let the silence stretch, absorbing the subtle shifts in posture, the flickers of anxiety that betrayed each carefully maintained facade. "It's quite unfortunate, really, the lengths to which one must go to preserve an illusion." Her gaze rested briefly on Edward, whose throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Deception, after all, is only as strong as the weakest link." Margaret exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of her chair. "This is absurd," she said, her voice clipped. "If you have something to say, Lady Evelyn, say it plainly instead of playing these little games." Evelyn tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "Oh, but Margaret, the truth is best unraveled delicately, don't you think, like a thread pulled from the seam of a carefully woven lie?" She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, how long did you think you could keep the letter hidden?" Margaret stiffened, but before she could speak, Edward's voice sliced through the silence. "There was no letter," he said quickly, too quickly. "Just speculation and unfounded accusations." Lady Evelyn's eyes gleamed. "How fascinating, Mr. Langley, that you would deny something I hadn't yet described." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "And yet, the fire in the study burned unusually hot that night, did it not? The embers still smouldering when the housekeeper entered at dawn." Julian finally spoke, his voice measured. "You're suggesting someone burned evidence." "I'm suggesting," Evelyn said, "that something was destroyed in great haste, and that something was quite possibly the truth behind Lord Hawthorne's murder." Margaret's fingers curled against her skirts. "You have no proof of that." "Perhaps not," Evelyn admitted, "but I do have inconsistencies. A missing telegram, a misplaced key, and an alibi that when scrutinized begins to unravel at the seams." Her gaze locked onto Edward. "You claim to have been in the East Wing when the bell rang, yet the servant who fetched you swore he saw you descending from Lord Hawthorne's study moments before." Edward's face drained of color. Evelyn continued, her voice almost gentle, "And then there's the matter of the glass. The brandy, untouched but laced with something far deadlier than mere spirits." She let her words linger in the charged silence before turning her attention to Julian. "Tell me, Mr. Warwick, why did you seem so certain Lord Hawthorne had been poisoned before the physician even confirmed it?" Julian's fingers twitched where they rested against the mantel. "Because it was obvious," he said smoothly, but there was a faint tremor in his voice. Evelyn sighed, sitting back. "Lies are like chains, gentlemen. The more you weave them, the tighter they become. And sooner or later," she lifted a delicate hand and let it fall, "they break." The room fell deathly still. The fire popped in the hearth, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. The walls of Hawthorne Hall had long concealed their secrets, but Lady Evelyn knew one truth with unwavering certainty: by morning they would hold them no longer. The dimly lit study of Ashford Manor was thick with tension, the flickering candlelight throwing long, uneasy shadows across the mahogany desk where Lord Ashford once sat in quiet authority. But now that seat of power lay empty, its former occupant reduced to a mere memory, a memory stained with betrayal and murder. Eleanor Whitmore, composed and unyielding, remained seated, her piercing gaze resting on Nathaniel Harrow, whose fingers twitched ever so slightly against the velvet armrest. Across from him, Vivian Alden clutched her pearl necklace, her breaths coming quick and shallow, while Henry Locke's stare remained fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace, his jaw set tight as though clenching the truth behind his teeth. But the weight of silence could only hold for so long. "You see," Eleanor began, her voice calm but edged with something sharp, something final, "the truth has a way of demanding its due, no matter how desperately one tries to bury it." Her gaze flicked to Nathaniel, catching the way his throat bobbed with a swallowed protest. "The letter, that was your undoing, wasn't it?" Nathaniel stiffened. After Lord Ashford was found slumped over his desk, you were seen rifling through the drawers, not in grief, not in confusion, but in desperation. You weren't looking for any ordinary document, you were searching for the letter. The one thing that could ruin you. She paused, allowing the words to settle, to sink deep. But you were too late, weren't you? Vivian's breath hitched and Henry shifted ever so slightly, his fingers curling into a fist against his knee. Someone else had already seen it, Eleanor continued, her voice never rising yet carrying the weight of inevitability. And that changed everything. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, his mask of composure slipping. You assume too much, he murmured, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Eleanor only smiled, a cold knowing thing. Do I? Because I find it rather curious that Lord Ashford, a man of rigid habits, suddenly decided to switch from his usual evening brandy to a cup of tea, the very cup that delivered his death. The silence was deafening. You prepared it, didn't you? Nathaniel shook his head, but the denial never reached his lips. Poison, Mr. Harrow, slow-acting, undetectable to the untrained eye, yet lethal in the right dosage. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice now a whisper but no less deadly. Tell me, was it the inheritance, the estate, or was it something far more dangerous that you feared, something written in that letter? Nathaniel's fingers curled against the fabric of his trouser. The fight in him was waning. And then of course, Eleanor went on, turning her gaze to Henry, we have the matter of opportunity. Lord Ashford wasn't alone that night, was he? No, someone else was with him in that study before he collapsed. Someone who ensured that the evidence, the one thing tying it all together, vanished into flames. Henry's jaw clenched, but still, he remained silent. The truth, gentlemen, Eleanor said, standing at last, her gaze sweeping over them all, is never truly buried. It lingers, waiting for the right moment to rise. And tonight, she let her words hang, watching as the weight of her deductions pressed down upon them. It has found its reckoning. Nathaniel's shoulders sagged as the last of his resistance crumbled. He had played his hand, but the game was over. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, the night pressing against the windows of Ashford Manor like an unrelenting spectre. But inside, within the confines of that dimly lit study, the ghost of truth had finally been set free. The heavy silence of Blackthorn Manor was shattered only by the distant howl of the wind against its ancient stone walls, a whisper of old secrets refusing to stay buried. In the grand study, where bookshelves loomed like silent witnesses, Julian Whitmore sat rigid in his chair, his fingers gripping the armrests as if they might anchor him to a reality slipping through his grasp. Across from him, Evelyn Stokes stood poised, her piercing gaze never wavering, her every word a blade cutting through his crumbling composure. You wanted to erase it all, didn't you? Her voice was steady, deliberate. The past, the truth, the one thing that could unravel everything you've built. But no matter how deep you bury the truth, Mr. Whitmore, it has a way of clawing itself back to the surface. Julian's breath was shallow, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain the last shreds of control. It wasn't meant to happen this way, he muttered, his voice raw with something between regret and defiance. But it did, Evelyn countered, taking a step forward. The dim firelight flickered against her profile, casting sharp shadows that danced like specters of the past. And now the pieces have all fallen into place. The letter. It was never just a document, was it? It was proof. Proof that would expose you, strip away everything, leave you with nothing. Across the room, Margaret Vale shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her pale fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. Arthur Langley, however, remained unmoving, his gaze locked onto the floor, his lips pressed into a grim line. Julian let out a short, bitter laugh. You think you understand everything, Miss Stokes, but you don't. That letter, it was a lie. Evelyn's expression remained unreadable. Was it? Then why were you so desperate to destroy it? Why did you wait until Lord Blackthorn's tea was left unattended? A flicker of panic crossed Julian's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. You poisoned him. she continued. The accusation delivered not with malice, but with the weight of certainty. A slow poison, subtle, something that wouldn't be detected right away. You only needed time to find the letter, time to burn what remained of your past before it came back to haunt you. Julian's fingers twitched against the armrest, the walls closing in. But you miscalculated, Evelyn said, her voice quieter now, almost gentle, yet no less damning. Lord Blackthorne read it before he died, didn't he? He saw the truth you tried so hard to bury. And then as the poison took hold, he tried to protect what little of it remained. You thought you could erase it all, but you only left behind more questions, more trails leading right back to you. The room was suffocating now, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Margaret's breath came shallow and uneven, her eyes darting toward Julian as if she had only just realized the depths of his desperation. Arthur finally lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his posture betraying the storm within. Evelyn took a final step forward. It wasn't about inheritance, it wasn't about money, it was about fear. Fear of being exposed for what you truly are. And fear, she let the word hang in the air, makes men do desperate things. Julian exhaled shakily, his hands finally falling away from the armrests. His fight was over. Beyond the manor's towering windows, the wind howled once more, carrying with it the ghosts of a truth that refused to be forgotten. The room was suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken words, and the lingering stench of betrayal. The once grand drawing-room of Ashford Hall, with its towering bookshelves and elegant chandeliers, now felt more like a tomb, a place where the past had clawed its way back to life, refusing to be buried. At the center of it all stood Victor Holloway, his once imposing figure now reduced to a shadow of itself. His hands, bound in iron restraints, trembled slightly, though whether from rage, regret, or sheer exhaustion, none could tell. Across from him, Eleanor Vance, the ever-composed investigator, studied him with that same calculating gaze, the one that had stripped away every carefully constructed lie until nothing remained but the cold, unbearable truth. "It was never about the inheritance, was it?" she said, her voice quiet yet unyielding, each syllable a hammer striking against his crumbling resolve. It was about the fear of exposure. About a past you tried so desperately to erase. But the past has a way of resurfacing, doesn't it? A bitter chuckle escaped Victor's lips, though there was no humor in it, only the remnants of a man who had lost everything. "You think you understand, Miss Vance, but you don't," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way." But even as he spoke, his words rang hollow, drowned by the suffocating silence of the room. Behind him, the fire had dwindled to embers, casting jagged shadows against the walls, as if the house itself mourned the tragedy that had unfolded within it. The gathered onlookers, figures who had once shared his trust, his name, his legacy, stared in stunned disbelief. Isabel Whitmore, his niece, stood frozen, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had known something was wrong, had sensed the unease in her uncle's eyes, but to see it laid bare, to witness the confession unfold with such brutal finality, was more than she could bear. To her right, Henry Aldridge, the ever-watchful family solicitor, remained rigid, his jaw clenched, his piercing gaze betraying the turmoil roiling beneath his otherwise impassive exterior. Victor Holloway, came the voice of Inspector Reeves, steady, unrelenting. "You are under arrest for the murder of Lord Ashford Holloway." The words, though expected, fell like a death knell, heavy and inescapable. The constable stepped forward, the cold metallic snap of the handcuffs punctuating the silence, sealing Victor's fate. He did not resist. There was nothing left to fight for. "Uncle Victor," Isabel whispered, her voice breaking as she took an unsteady step forward. "Why?" For the first time that evening, Victor looked at her, truly looked at her, and in that fleeting moment, something passed between them, something raw, something broken, because I was afraid, he admitted, and for the first time, the weight of his own words seemed to crush him. Afraid of losing everything, afraid of being nothing. The admission hung in the air, a final haunting echo of the man he once was. And then, with slow, deliberate steps, he was led from the room, the heavy doors closing behind him with a resounding finality. Eleanor exhaled, the tension in her shoulders barely easing as she turned to the remaining occupants of the room. Isabel, her expression shattered, her world torn apart. Henry, his ever-calculating mind already processing the ramifications. And beyond them, the house itself, silent, looming, as if holding its breath. Fear, she said at last, her voice barely more than a whisper, has destroyed greater men than Victor Holloway, and it will again. With that, she turned and strode toward the door, leaving them to their grief, to their questions, to the ruin that fear had wrought. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a reminder that though the mystery had been solved, some ghosts would never truly rest. The heavy silence in Langley Manor felt almost unbearable, as though the very walls had absorbed the weight of grief and betrayal. The once grand drawing room, its velvet drapes pulled tightly against the encroaching dusk, seemed to suffocate those still lingering in its shadows. At the center of it all, Eleanor Holloway sat rigidly, her trembling hands clasped in her lap, her face as pale as the porcelain teacup that had long since gone cold beside her. "It's over," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, but the words carried no relief, only an eerie, hollow finality. Across from her, Cecilia Harrow, her oldest friend and once her closest confidant, shifted in her chair, her dark eyes filled with something that resembled both pity and regret. "You did all you could, Eleanor," she said, her voice steady, a soft reassurance in the midst of the storm. "We all did," but Eleanor let out a slow, shuddering breath, her fingers tightening around the delicate embroidery of her dress. "It wasn't enough," she murmured. "First my husband, now Robert. And for what? Secrets that should have been left buried." Her voice cracked, and the room held its breath. Meanwhile, at the far end of the room, Florence Belgrave, whose presence had been a mere shadow in the chaos of the past few days, sat still and watchful. The fear that had gripped her before, the unshakable weight of suspicion, seemed to have finally lifted from her slender shoulders. Yet, even in relief, she did not relax. Her voice, when it finally came, was quiet, measured. "I need you to believe me," she said, looking directly at Inspector Aldridge, who had remained by the window watching the final pieces of this wretched puzzle fall into place. The letters, the telegrams, they were never about Langley Manor, they were about my father's affairs. An old dispute, nothing more. But I didn't say anything because," she hesitated, swallowing hard, "because I was afraid. Afraid that anything I said would only make me look more guilty." The inspector turned to her at last, his expression unreadable. "Fear has a way of twisting the truth, Miss Belgrave," he said simply. "But in the end, the truth has a way of surfacing despite it." Florence lowered her gaze, nodding faintly. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to hide. From the corner of the room, Christopher Langford, the estate's long-trusted solicitor, finally spoke, his voice edged with the weight of his own unspoken burdens. "We all became entangled in something far beyond our control," he admitted, his sharp gaze flickering toward Eleanor. "But now, with the truth exposed, there are practical matters to attend to. The inheritance, the estate, the shattered remnants of a family torn apart by deception and greed." But even as he spoke, his tone was distant, as though the enormity of it all had drained him beyond words. Inspector Aldridge exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping the dimly lit room one final time before settling on Eleanor. "The authorities will handle the rest," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Justice has been served, but at what cost?" The words hung in the air, unspoken yet understood by all. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the final remnants of a tragedy that had at last reached its bitter end. And yet, even as the case closed, the ghosts of Langley Manor would not be so easily silenced.